Last night we looked at the great controversy through the Old Testament, and we just sort of skipped through it. I actually could have spent a week on looking at it as each individual part. But coming to the words of Genesis 3:15, the promise that God made before he pronounced judgment upon Adam and Eve. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. Yes, the war has gone on. Satan has tried everything in his power to stop the birth of Christ. He tried to do it by stamping out all believers before the flood. He tried to stop the progeny of Abraham through Sarah to be produced. He attempted to wipe them out at several times. He put them in bondage of slavery in Egypt. And then he corrupted Israel. He tried to wipe out the line of David. Every attempt he made to stop the birth of the promised Messiah. But he failed. And in the 4th year of Herod the Great, approximately 4 BC, 6 BC, we're not too sure exactly in the date, a small child was born. But it's an incredible story when you think of it. Satan's first attempt upon the birth of child was on Joseph. When Joseph discovered that Mary was in child, he was going to put her away. It meant that the father image of this child was not going to be there, and she would have been born to a single mother, which would have been absolutely disastrous. That was Satan's first attack upon the birth of the child. But he failed. For God came with a response and told Joseph that she had been faithful to him, and explained the matter. Joseph, being the man that he was, a man of good character and good standing, accepted the word of God and became the father to the young child. But Satan had only just started. He was determined on all accounts. And the interesting thing, Satan doesn't mind hurting innocents to get his way. He will do what it takes. And so as the Magi, and here's the interesting thing, the children of Israel, God's people, were all asleep. It was the Magi, the three or four wise men. We don't know how many are. Tradition has 3 because of the 3 gifts. Who were these wise men? We find out in Isaiah. Believe it or not, they were descendants of Abraham through his other wives. They came and paid homage to the king. Shepherds came and paid homage, but the rulers of Israel were totally oblivious. And here's the funny thing. When the wise men came to Herod and asked, Herod was rather flustered, so he called in the priests, and the priests told him, oh yes, it is about time. He's going to be born in Bethlehem. Isn't that interesting? But they weren't interested. But Herod the Great was an interesting man. He was a cruel tyrant who wanted to hang on to his throne under all costs. As a matter of fact, he killed some of his sons in fear that they would plot against him. He was not a friendly character. And so when the Magi went, he said to them, hey, when you've worshipped the king, come back and tell me so I can worship him. He had no intention of worshipping the king. His intentions was murder. The wise men and their innocent had planned to come back, and it was a vision from God who counteracted the plans of Herod. For they had vision to not go back, and they went home a different way. When Herod realised they weren't coming back, he hatched another plan. Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. When Herod realised that he'd been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious and gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Satan was determined to destroy Christ before he could do his work. This was an attempt of Satan to destroy the coming of the Messiah. If he could kill him under 2, he couldn't do his job. And so Herod's soldiers went to Bethlehem and killed all the male children under the age of 2. Just to get one. But God counteracted in a vision to Joseph. He said, "Take the child and flee to Egypt." But Mary and Joseph were just a poor family. How could they afford to flee into a foreign country? And they stayed there until Herod the Great died. And so when they came back, Christ would have been 4, 5 or 6. But how did they afford to live there? God had already provided from the gifts from the wise men. The gold, frankincense and myrrh were worth a fortune. And that gave them the money they required to live in exile. Every time Satan attacked, God came back with an answer. But it's very interesting. Jesus, as he grew up with his brothers and sisters. Who are these brothers and sisters? Well, some people think they were of Joseph's to a first wife, and this was his second wife. We have no evidence to this, but it could have been. But they were mostly children that Mary had after the birth of Christ. But if you go to John chapter 7, we have this account. John chapter 7 and verses, starting in verse 1. And it says, "After this, Jesus went around in Galilee, prophesying, saying, staying away from Judah because of the Jews there were wanting to take his life, and we'll come back to that later. But when the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles was near, Jesus' brothers said to him, 'You ought to leave here and go to Judea so that your disciples may see the miracles you do. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you are doing these things, show yourself to the world.' For even his own brothers did not believe in him. Therefore Jesus told them, 'The right time for me has not yet come. For you any time is right. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify what it does is evil. You go to the feast. I am not yet going up to this feast, because for me the right time has not yet come.' Having said this, he stayed in Galilee." The interesting thing, his brothers did not believe who he was. Can you imagine growing up with Jesus as your brother? Man, it must have been bad news. You know what it's like growing up. We like to push the boundaries a little bit, modify the rules, do things that our parents would absolutely be horrified if they discovered. Trouble is, with Jesus as your brother, he wouldn't be into any of that. If mum and dad said don't do it, he didn't do it. He must have been a pain in the neck. Goody goody two shoes, and wouldn't have we picked on him. Can you understand that his childhood was not easy? His brothers did not even believe who he was. And you know, it is interesting how brothers influence you. I'm going to tell a story about my older brother, and because it's being taped, he might hear it, but it'll be okay now. My older brother, he's 3.5 years older than me, Ray. Fully trained teacher, fully trained nurse. And I've always had problems with my brother because people tell me he's his sister. Anyway, that's beside the point. Now, my brother has never really thought that I was ministerial material and that I would much rather be better off doing something else. It's interesting, isn't it? My brother disagrees with that now. He got baptised again last year. He's really on fire for the Lord. This year, and he's really on fire. He has a different opinion now. He thinks it was the right decision. I went in ministry, which is great. But he is doing an incredible job where he is in witnessing. He's on fire. And that's what we all should be, on fire. Since his baptism, he just rang me last night and he informed me that 2 of his friends that he's been in contact with have made the Lord and plan to be baptised in the next couple of days or weeks. So that's what's happening. He's out there. But his brothers opposed him. And it wasn't until after his resurrection that his brothers realised he was the Messiah and the Saviour. It wasn't until after the resurrection. So in Jesus' growing up, he had his brothers nagging, pushing and prodding and trying to get him. You know, you ever been it? Don't brothers and sisters know which buttons to push on their brothers and sisters to get them to lose it? They just know how to do it and watch their sibling go off the deep end. They know which buttons to push. And sometimes you brothers and sisters delight in doing it to each other. And they try and do it in such a way that mum and dad will see them just at the price they let fly, and they step back and watch their brother and sister really cop. Talking to those who know about that, I can see it on your faces. It's been there, done that. All this was Satan's plot to try and cause him to lose. Then we come that he began his ministry. Matthew chapter 4. He was baptized, and now it came time for him to begin his ministry. But first he went out into the wilderness. Sometimes we think this is the only time that Jesus was tempted. No, it wasn't. While Christ lived on the earth, Satan marshalled all his hosts and all his energies to get Jesus to fall. Because if he could get Jesus to fall, he won the war. It was an all or nothing event. This was the battle who chose who would win or who would lose. And for that 33 years, Satan, it would have been the best time to live because Satan was so busy trying to trip up Christ, it might have been easy for everyone else. It says, when Jesus was led by the Spirit, verse 1, into the desert to be tempted by the devil, after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. Now, it's very interesting. Fasting for 40 days and 40 nights is about the limit that you can fast totally before you start doing damage to your body. That's about the limit. And when Christ went out there, I doubt he had some extra fat that he could get rid of. That's a modern day problem. Then the tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." An interesting temptation. I don't know about you, but I don't have that temptation. And that wouldn't matter whether I'd been hungry for 800 days. I wouldn't have that temptation because I know there is no way I can turn stones into bread. That is far, far, far beyond my capabilities. But think about Jesus. He is the Creator God who spoke, and it was. A universe sprung into existence at a word. Remembering, and this is a temptation that we forget that Christ had that none of us will have. He had the temptation to use his power for his own use. And he never did. He always relied upon the Father for his power. Hear the India. If you are the Son of God. Satan's saying, I don't think you're the Son of God. You prove it to me. Come on, prove it to me. Turn these stones to bread. The Son of God can do that. Come on. You get the implication of the temptation? If. How did Christ know he was the Son of God? By faith. By faith. Because his divinity had been laid aside, it was cloaked in humanity. And it had the limits of humanity. If. You know, Christ could have said, am I the Son of God really? Well, I could check it. Let's see if I am. Do you get it? If. Jesus answered, it is written, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Father. His response was the same every time. It is written. And then Satan took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. If you are the Son of God, he said, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up on their hands so that you will not strike your feet against the stone. Again, that doubt, if. But there's another implication. Can you imagine as he stood on the temple that he jumped off? The people would have seen him and gasped in horror as he fell to the ground. But as the angels rescued him, he lighted and stood on the ground and walked around as if. Could you imagine how people would have sprung to him? Part of this temptation was to draw attention to himself, to make a spectacle. But Jesus answered him, it is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendour. All this I will give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. We don't realise the full dimension of this temptation. Satan was offering to give it to him. And if he was to bow down to him, he would not have to die on Calvary. If he was to bow down to him, he could slip away and say it's done and slip off to heaven. He wouldn't have to have the torment of his brothers. And he was just beginning his ministry, and he knew he would get the torment of the religious leaders. He had read his Bible. He knew that his disciples would argue and squabble, that one would betray him, and that he would be led like a criminal and crucified and die alone. He knew all that. He could do it the easy way. Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him, and angels came and attended to him. Sometimes we think these were the only temptations that Christ had. Yes, there was 3 important, critical temptations. But Satan was badgering him every step of every moment of every day. He was like a nagging on his shoulder and his ear, constantly trying to get him. But Christ stood firm. He knew there was no easy way. It is written. He was prepared to pay the total cost. But that wasn't the only way Satan attacked. Mark chapter 3, and this happens several times. And it sounds strange. And I think we miss what's really happening here. Mark chapter 3 and verse 11. It says here, whenever the evil spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." That might sound like good news, mightn't it? But it wasn't. The devils acknowledged him as the Son of God to discredit him. To discredit him. It says, but he gave them strict orders not to tell who he was. See, Satan wanted to expose him as early as possible. That's why his brothers told him to early go down into Jerusalem. See, Satan wanted to finish it before Christ had the opportunity to train his disciples. He had to stop and intervene. He had to stop Christ completing his task. He had to shorten the time so the disciples were not ready and so the message would not be complete. He was doing everything in his power to thwart the plan of salvation. John chapter 8. John chapter 8 and 59. The conversation had come, claim about Christ, and they'd asked who him. He says, before Abraham was, I am. And for anyone who feels that Christ did not claim his divinity, he did here. He said, I am. He was the one that spoke to Abraham, the one who spoke to Moses in the burning bush. He was calling himself the God of Israel. And how do we know it? In verse 57 it says, "You are not yet 50 years old," the Jews said to him, "and you have seen Abraham?" Then it says here, "I tell you the truth," Jesus answered, "before Abraham was born, I am." Now it's interesting, he says "I am," not "I was." That's correct English, and that would have been the correct Hebrew in Hebrew, or Aramaic, or whatever language you were speaking. But he said, "I am," the very name of God. He not only said he was there before Abraham, but he was the God, Yahweh, speaking to Abraham. And how do we know he said that? The immediate response of the Jews there. At this they picked up stones to stone him. Why? Blasphemy. A man calling himself God. But Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. And this was not the first time that they tried to kill him. They tried to do it several times, once to push him over a cliff, other times to stone him. Anyway, to get rid of him. The religious leaders were jealous of him. They wanted to see an end of this rabbi because he was upsetting everyone. He was saying salvation was available to sinners, to publicans, to Samaritans. For he preached the good news and released the captives. Not only that, he was healing the sick, raising the dead. The religious leaders had to stop this because their power was going to be undermined. Matthew 22 and verse 23. Matthew 22, 23. It says, "The same day the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him with a question." And the number of times they came to Christ with a question. The Sadducees, whose wife will she be at the resurrection? The Pharisees, this woman has been caught in adultery. The law of Moses says stone to her. What say you? Constantly they were coming to him with questions to trap him. And every time they thought they had a question he could not answer. They wanted to discredit him. With the woman that caught in adultery, if Christ had said stone her, they would have run off to the Roman authorities and says, "This man's usurping authority because you only have the power of death penalty, we don't have it." But if Christ said, "Don't stone her," they would have said, "Hey, he's wiping away the law of Moses." They tried everything in their power to discredit Jesus. And behind every one of them was Satan. Satan wanted to destroy the ministry of Jesus. When you think as the apostles rowed across the Sea of Galilee and all of a sudden a storm came up, they were fearful that the boat would sink. Christ was sleeping in the back of the boat. Was this storm coincidence? No, they were right in their fear, for Satan wanted to sink the boat and drown Christ. It wasn't just an ordinary storm. And things like this were happening constantly. Satan wished to destroy the ministry of Jesus Christ. And even the disciples argued between themselves. I don't know, sometimes Jesus must have felt like throwing up his hands in horror and saying, will these men ever get it? When you read the scenes of the Last Supper, they were fighting between themselves. When Christ at the Garden of Gethsemane had told them he was about to be betrayed, Satan reinforced his attacks upon Christ. And Christ said to the disciples, pray for me, because he knew this was going to be hard. And what did they do? They fell asleep. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, the pressure of sin came upon Christ. And as our sins were placed upon him, he felt the separation from the Father. And he felt all alone. And the only one there was the accuser of the brethren, saying, this is too much. They're not worth saving. Go home. Forget about it. John 13. I think I've done that one. Just have a look. John 13, washing the disciples' feet, verse 21. Just to get the text there. After he said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, I tell you the truth, one of you is going to betray me. One of his friends was plotting against him. They were arguing. 19, verses 1 to 3. Chapter 19 of John, verses 1 to 3. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. How did they flog him? With a whip, a leather whip, with pieces of glass and lead woven into the whip, so that as it lashed upon the back and they pulled it off, it dug into the flesh and ripped it apart. It says the soldiers mocked him. What they did, they put a bag over his head. And as he stood there, one would strike him with all his might upon the head and say, who hit you? If you're a prophet, tell us. With the persecution, the floggings and the beatings that he received here, it's a miracle that he lived to survive to go to the cross. Because those beatings were not just men, it was of a supernatural evil trying to destroy him, stopping him from going to the cross. See, for the sacrifice to be willing, Christ had to give up his life. So Satan was trying to take his life. Christ's beating was such that he was hardly recognizable. His back was ripped to threads. His face was bloodied and bruised. The attack was so vicious that parts of his beard had been ripped out with the flesh, and it hung. And then they led him out and placed a cross upon his battered back to carry it. Humanly, he did not have the strength and power. He had to have the will to live so that he would live long enough to give up his life willingly. Matthew chapter 26. Matthew 26. The Garden of Gethsemane, knowing what was about to come, he says, going a little further, he fell down on his face to the ground and prayed, Father, if it possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. And knowing the events that were going to happen in the next 36 hours or so, he willingly moved forward. Satan knew that it was all on the line. If he could only get Christ to give up. And so you find as he's on the cross in agony and the way it was done, the crucifixion was designed for maximum pain. Your arms were stretched out. And in stretching out and you were hung from your arms, it is very, very difficult to breathe. And there is only one way you can breathe. You've got to push up with your legs because your legs were bent. But the push up in your legs would cause excruciating pain from the nails piercing your legs. And as you pushed up to take your next breath, the pain would shoot up from the legs into the whole body. You would gasp for breath and collapse again. And as you collapsed down, it would ring into your arms where the nails were in your hand. And your whole body would ache. That's crucifixion. But on top of that, his flesh was literally hanging from his back. And as he moved on the cross, those open wounds on the wood, can you imagine the feeling as they moved upon the wood and it rasped that raw flesh? And then the priests from the bottom say, if you are the Son of God, come down. He can save others, but he can't save himself. What a true statement. For him to save himself would have meant each one of us would have been lost. To save us, he had to lose himself. But as much as that physical pain, that emotional pain of the sin, the pain that hurt him most of all was feeling separated from the Father. And those words ring out, Father, why hast thou forsaken me? He knew the answer. He died on that cross, totally and utterly alone. But the whipping didn't kill him. The cross didn't kill him. The bashings didn't kill him. Your and my sin killed him. Then he said those words, it is finished. And he gave up the ghost. He surrendered his life so that you and I could live. And at that moment, the war was won. Satan had lost. And the viewing universe, who had watched these scenes in pain, silence, and in horror, their beloved Jesus, their Maker, was dying on a cross for a people, for a world that weren't even interested. Colossians chapter 2, verse 15. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 15. It says, having. Let's pick it up a little earlier. God made you alive with Christ. He forgave all of our sins, having cancelled the written code and its regulations that was against us and that stood opposed to us. He took it away, nailing it to the cross. And having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. As Christ said, it is done. Your salvation had been paid for. Satan had lost. And the proof happened on that Sunday morning when the tomb broke forth and Christ rose. The battle, the war had been won. But the war wasn't over. Revelation chapter 12 and verse 10. Revelation chapter 12 and verse 10. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, now has come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ. For the accuser of our brothers, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. His access to heaven was over. They overcome him by the blood of the Lamb and by the testimony of by the word of their testimony. It says, therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you that dwell in. But woe to the earth, the sea, because the devil has come down to you. He is full with fury because he knows his time is short. And though the war has been won, the battle continues. It continues as that new fledgling church, going to be started by those 11 disciples who ran, who had deserted him, who were hiding. They were going to be the ones that God was going to rely on to spread the message that the victory is won. So come tomorrow night as we look at the great controversy, the war between Christ and Satan in the early church, as it preached the good news, the war is won.